up to the lecture that ran short today. So I'm not going to go over everything that was covered today, but I do want to provide a little bit of a summary and then offer the conclusion of the reading excerpt that you had. For the test itself, I will not expect a great level of specificity in talking about Durkheim, because last class and this class, I really just lectured and we didn't get a chance to get into the readings as much as we normally would. But today we talked about suicide. So again, this was Durkheim's 1897 book that really set the stage for what would happen next with sociology. It was the first true sociological study. So in his earlier work, Rules for the Sociological of a Sociological Method and Division of Labor, he provides more theorizing and understanding of both how to study society and also the problems that exist within society as we move from more traditional forms or organization or types of solidarity to more contemporary forms of solidarity that are marked by an increased division of labor. And what was key with that, it was moving from a group that was held together through a shared collective consciousness with some aspect of individuality to groups where separation, difference, ideas of being an individual who did not share the same religion, belief system, political ideas, upbringing with your neighbor, right? The collective consciousness can no longer hold people together. So he says, all right, so the thing that holds us together is through being linked by a feeling of belonging or need or connection. In suicide, he takes this large-scale comparative analysis, trying to get a sense of why is it that suicide rates rise and fall? And why is he looking around and seeing high rates in a number of places? So again, in doing so, he really does the first multivariate analysis, because he's looking at all these different independent variables to explain the dependent variable of suicide, each of these being social facts, numbers that exist above the individual. So he'll look at things like, as I said, family size, marriage, type of job that you have, religion, and then he'll see, does that affect, through comparative analysis, do those have some correlation with higher or lower suicide rates? And then the next step is try to understand what that mechanism is. And so, for instance, he notices when he studies religion, if you look at the assigned chapter, he finds, as mentioned in class, that Protestants tended to have a higher suicide rate than Catholics. Now, already he's doing an intersection of different variables, because he then goes on to talk about, well, if you look at society at that time, the Catholic Church generally has Catholics generally have lower levels of education than Protestants. Protestants focus a little bit more on both education and individuality. So he's like, okay, well, maybe that's part of the mechanism or explanation. Then he looks at the Jewish population. He says, well, the Jewish population has on average even higher level of education. And he thinks about how education would be a sign of, if we go back to the two parts of the consciousness, with education, it leads to increased individual consciousness and less of collective consciousness, right? Because you start to think critically, you start to question things. And he's like, well, that's part of the Jewish faith. However, the Jewish faith also puts a huge emphasis on connection through reading scripture, through engaging in religious act, even more than Protestants. So he's trying to make sense of how religion can be a part of the story. And some of that analysis doesn't hold up today, because we see a shift in how people relate to their different religious faiths. But the key thing here is he's trying to come up with a way to do statistical analysis at the large scale to understand this trend, which seems like it would be very much about the individual. But he's saying, I'm not going to biological explanation. I'm not going to psychological explanation. I want to have something that really can explain why it is when wealth comes to a country, suicide goes up. When the World Fair comes to a country, suicide goes up. When a country is consistently in a state of poverty, suicide rates does not go up. But if a country with wealth drops to a lower level of wealth, there's some sort of economic crisis, suicide rates go up, right? And again, he's trying to make sure that he does this in a scientific and objective manner. That is his focus. All right, so that's where we got to. And then we started to talk about his emphasis on equilibrium, right? He says, finding equilibrium is key. This is potentially difficult with humans. With animals, they seem to, once they have their needs met, find a state of equilibrium. But with humans, there's always a desire for more and more. There's a potential for greed. There's a potential to want what other people have, or want more than other people have, or simply want for the sake of want. And he has some great passages on this in the reading. And he says, well, we do find a few places that can offer some sort of restraint. One of the places he points to is the law. Another place he points to is the government, which is basically, through the law, right? Certain laws about what you can have, what you can't have, how much you have to share with others. And he says this is really key. Or we could find it through religion. And again, as I pointed out in class, this is interesting because so far we've had theorists who are very critical, especially during the Enlightenment. All these Enlightenment thinkers are very critical of religion. You have Kant who's saying, no, that just holds you back for thinking from yourself and gets in the way of pure logic. Marx sees it as investing energy in something outside of yourself that simply, really, he's saying you're investing in something else and you're not bettering the society. You're not bettering the community. You're not fighting against the system that's causing problems. There's a famous line about Marx saying that religion is an opiate of the masses, right? Something to placate people. But Durkheim is saying, no, this is important, not because it's necessarily true, but rather because it presents people with some sort of boundary. It guides them. It helps them understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, right? And a lot of people in the religious community were furious with Durkheim because he was saying that it was a socially constructed belief system. But he was also angering people who were critical of religion because he said it had a lot of value. So again, he often exists in that in-between state because he's saying it's not about whether it's true or not, but it's a social fact. Right? Religion fits all those three qualities that are necessary for something to be a social fact that I laid out last time. And just to remind you, because I remember I got an email about this after class I never answered. The three qualities of a social fact, the three characteristics, it's external to the individual. If you are born into a society that is Buddhist, or if you're born into a society that is Muslim or Christian or Jewish or any religion we come up with, right? It's external to the individual. You can't just change it by yourself. You can choose to not believe it, but you don't choose the social fact, the religion that you're born under. And they're also very different from a physical fact in that they're very, very, very slow to change, but they could potentially change. The way Catholicism is practiced has changed over time. The way people relate to their Catholic faith has changed over time. And they're not necessarily the same across all time and space, right? It varies based on where you are. Second quality, it constrains the individual. Yes, being born into a specific religion constrains what you do. It constrains how you dress. It constrains what you do on your days that you're supposed to engage in prayer or the moments in the day where you're supposed to engage in prayer. It affects what marriage looks like. It affects what sexuality it looks like and how people respond to it. It affects all these different things, right? And then it requires social organization that is generally throughout the social unit. And yes, religion fits that quality as well. Okay, so back to the reading. That was a little bit of a deviation. So he says it's harder to find equilibrium in humans than in animals. So there's these places that we find restraint. And then he says, well, this is particularly important because you're going to see hierarchy develop, right? But this is different than Marx as well because he says, as long as it's just and fair, and he said this in Division of Labor as well, as long as it's just and fair, it doesn't necessarily lead to that type of suffering or antagonism or anger that Marx predicted. Inequality in itself is not something that's bad. Now he says, the closer it is to everyone being born, say, he even brings it up, he's like, hey, say you get rid of inheritance, and then where you end up, everyone understands as a result of their actions, that would lead to less conflict. Because the key is that your social position, the hierarchy, the divisions should seem natural and not forced. Remember, that was from the Division of Labor. So if you are born into the society with extreme inequalities and it gets in the way of being able to feel like you have a purpose or an ability to realize your potential, then that will lead to some sort of antagonism or unrest, right? But if it seems to be more fitting and you understand the position that you're in, well, then it's going to lead to a place of stability. All right, so when does all the bad stuff happen? That's the question. Well, for Durkheim, perhaps not surprising, the bad stuff happens when, just going to drag the reading over here, when society is disturbed by some painful crisis or by beneficent but abrupt transition. So when it's some sort of bad crisis or something good happens but it's abrupt, it is momentarily incapable of exercising this influence. Thence comes the sudden rise in the curve of suicides, which we have pointed out above. So, what is he saying here? When there's some sort of disturbance, whether it's positive or negative, it's difficult to achieve that equilibrium. So he continues, in the case of economic disaster, which suddenly casts certain individuals into a lower state than their previous ones, they must reduce their requirements, restrain their needs, learn greater self-control. All of this is really difficult for society to adapt to because you don't have the places providing structure, providing a sense of how to do that. These conditions get forced upon people and they seem, as a result, intolerable. This detaches them from reduced existence even before they've made a trial of it. It seems like a forced hierarchy, a forced change that leads to increased suicide. However, as he points out, it is the same if the source of the crisis is an abrupt growth of power and wealth. Then truly, as the conditions of life were changed, the standard according to which needs were regulated can no longer remain the same, for it varies with the social resources since it largely determines the share of each class of producers. The scale is upset, but a new scale cannot immediately be improvised because social facts change slowly, right? Suddenly there's a boom in wealth and all these people are having new lives, new houses, new possibilities, and their appetites, as he says here, they become disoriented. They no longer recognize the limits proper to them. And you would think this happens all the time, right? People look at someone who makes a ton of money through being an athlete or a musician or wins the lottery. And you say, well, they must be so happy. But the studies of it show that there's actually a lot of confusion and there's a lot of depression and there ends up being a lot of drug use, right? All those things you'd say, well, why? Didn't the person get everything they wanted? But he says, no, that can lead to the state of anomie. Right? It's thus further heightened by passions being less disciplined, precisely when they need more disciplining, when you need that structure. Okay, back to the reading. And then he says, also on 47, you can look at this as well. Well, you would think, again, intuitively, you might think that with poverty, you would see an increased amount of suicide. But he points out again, this exclamation is confirmed by the remarkable immunity of poor countries. Poverty protects against suicide because it is a restraint in itself. No matter how one acts, desires have to depend upon resources to some extent. Actual possessions are partly the criterion of those aspired to. And he continues on, and you can look at this yourself. And this is not a celebration of poverty. I think some people read Durkheim as saying, oh, poverty is a good thing because of this. He's not saying poverty is good. He recognizes all the negatives and horrors that go with it. But he's trying to understand one specific thing. His dependent variable is suicide, and it's not happening. He says, well, how do we make sense of that? Well, because there is a forced equilibrium and an understanding of your position. It's not something that would make people happy, but he can show by the data it's not this instability and this lack of sense of where you are. Okay. But it points out, continue on, because again, he builds this in this very logical manner. And that's what's key about his writing. He's very scientific in this study. I'm going to start with the data. And he makes this argument for how one should do research. It's not going from theory to data. He says, start with the data, look for patterns, then you begin to theorize them. This is how it works. This is how he wants to build the discipline. And he says, okay, if this anomie that he's concerned about, this sense of lack of connection, this sense of confusion, the sense of lack of understanding of who you are and why you are the person you are and what your purpose is, if it were only caused in intermittent spurts and acute crises, it might cause the social suicide rate to vary from time to time, but it would not be a regular constant factor. In one sphere of social life, however, the sphere of trade and industry, it is actually in a chronic state. So here he makes the point, you can see the rise of fall of suicide rates if you look at a geographic region, and there will be some variation. And he's given us a number of factors that can help explain that variation. Could be the religion of the time, could be an economic boom or bust. There's a number of factors that can do it. However, what he's pointing out here is within certain types of jobs, you will find a specific pattern. Right? In one sphere of social life, the sphere of trade and industry, it is actually in a chronic state. So you can compare across different industries, and at the time he does so, and he finds something that's very telling. When he looks at the suicide rates, he finds that people in industry, and this is across all these different countries, right? So the pattern holds across different religions, across different levels of education, across different family structures. And he says in industry, you have much higher rates, right here, you have much higher rates than you do in agriculture. And so this provides more evidence for what he's worried about. And actually, it's interesting to look over at the liberal professions. We show a specimen, the one in which the suicide rate is highest. We don't need to get caught up in that. But the key thing, if you think about what he's looking at the shift from mechanical to organic solidarity. And he's saying, with that shift from mechanical to organic solidarity, there becomes a loss of equilibrium. People are finding their way again. People are finding their purpose. People are finding their path. With the exception of Belgium and Württemberg, you can see very clearly this pattern. And so he says this is part of the story. And then in other areas of the book, he goes into detail trying to make sense of these two exceptions. Okay. Now we get to the final points. All right, so we talked about the job chart. We talked about how religion and government has lost its power, and instead it's the economy, especially when you're moving into industry, which in a sense, a lot of people are suffering in industry, but there's a promise of the potential of getting all this capital, which is very different than the person working in their traditional job or working in the farm or working in agriculture, where you're not seeking to be that millionaire, billionaire, that all powerful person. There's already a built-in limit. And there's structure. And there's also a clear connection to what you're providing for other people and what they need. So he's saying religion and the government loses its power, economy pushes for greed and expansion. That's why we see it's the independent worker, the one in the factory, who's suffering from anomie. All right, you can, again, looking at this chart, you can see the evidence that he's offering. But then we get to the most famous part of this reading. He sets us up, and it's only like the last two paragraphs of the reading. So it's interesting. This is the focus of the part, but it's only in the last two paragraphs he does this. He says, we can see different types of suicide occurring and at different rates based on this two-dimensional chart that he lays out. And in the podcast, Seth Abrudin talks about how it's really hard sometimes to figure out how to measure regulation versus integration, and they often blend together. So this has been one of the areas that people critique Durkheim, but it is a really useful tool for understanding these four different categories he's presenting us with. So he's saying the two dimensions that he's focused on, the two dimensions that you can think about in a society, and this could be based on the education, religion, family size, marriage, all that stuff, but it boils down to his mechanism. Remember, it's going back to, well, how do we know it's not this causality saying, or not just correlation? He's saying this is the mechanism. It's all about questions of regulation and integration. Regulation is how much some higher force is structuring life. That's where he's talking about religion, government, economic powers, all that stuff, right? It's the thing that guides you and puts a cap on what you're supposed to be doing or not supposed to be doing. It tells you what actions are okay or not okay. It tells you what actions are legal or not illegal. It tells you which actions are morally appropriate or immoral. Then he says, and this is probably even more important for scholars who follow Durkheim, it's about integration. It's how much you are integrated into a group. How much do you feel connected to other people in that group? How much do you feel like the only one who matters is yourself? Again, we can see some overlap with Tocqueville, who came before Durkheim. Tocqueville, also a French theorist, right? Durkheim's French. Tocqueville is also a French theorist. So Durkheim clearly had paid attention to what Tocqueville was saying. So that's worth thinking about. That would be a potential essay question, thinking about comparing the two of them. So he's worried about two things: regulation and integration. And then he lays out the different types of suicide that can come from the intersection of these two different axes. So he says, well, let's look at traditional forms of suicide, because he's going to say there's two that are more commonly found in contemporary life, where we see organic solidarity, and two found in mechanical solidarity. With mechanical solidarity, you have altruistic suicide, which is a type of suicide. So right here, high regulation, high integration. This is a type of suicide that occurs when, because both of those are so high, it's rare that it happens, but when it does happen, it will be seen as a sacrifice. You're so involved with the group, and the group's norms and goals become more important than your own needs and goals, right? Your collective consciousness overwhelms your individual consciousness, and then you would take your life for the cause. That could be military service, where a soldier dies for his country. It could be a suicide bomber who's sacrificing themselves for a religious or political cause. It could be a mother even pushing their child to safety, right? This is all a case of really high integration. The mother example wouldn't fit with high regulation. The other ones would. You could think of a cult. A cult sacrifice would be the ultimate example of this. Every aspect of your life is dictated by the cult. You're so integrated in the community that your individual life doesn't matter anymore, right? This is one of the things that happens when cults have this like mass suicide that happens. That would be altruistic suicide. The other one that he sees as more of a traditional form is fatalistic suicide. This would be a case where people commit suicide when their lives are kept under tight regulation. So we could see that on the chart, but they're not integrated into society. You're living their life under extreme rules and high expectations while not feeling like part of something bigger, or even being specific. Sorry, the audio cut out for a second there. So as I was saying, this would be an example of living under extremely high regulation, right? So every aspect of your life is dictated. There's rules telling you what to do, when you can do it. You're not allowed to make choices on your own. However, you're not integrated into the group. So this would be an example of prisoners who end up committing suicide. Would be incredibly high regulation, but very low integration. This also can happen, as Durkheim points to, in extremely conservative or traditional religious, often very religious groups, where every aspect of you is about the collective conscious. Every aspect of you, aspect of your life is dictated, but then something happens where you're no longer part of the group, where you no longer feel to be part of the group. You somehow don't feel connected, and therefore you don't have the freedom to express that individuality or let it play out, but you don't have the integration to make you feel like you're part of something. Maybe you're excommunicated or banned from the group. However, the two that he focuses the most on are the ones that he associates with a higher division of labor, a higher degree of individuality, or we could talk about, using his own terms, it would be in the case of organic solidarity. So we could look at the one with the star. We've got low regulation and high integration. This would be the time that he's pointing to where you experience anomie, right? This is a type of suicide that's committed during times of great stress or change. Without regulation, a person can't set reachable goals. Your goals can't be reached. Your frustration increases. Life becomes too much to handle. It becomes meaningless. That would be an example of the market crashing or spiking. The beginning of the reading is all about this, right? And so it's that lack of stability. It's not that there isn't integration to some degree in society. There's high integration, but there's that low regulation. That's why it's sometimes confusing for people to think about. But again, I like to think about, not like as in enjoy, but in terms of making sense. You could imagine the person who suddenly has this incredible degree of success, wins the lottery, and is depressed. And you're like, well, what's going on? Because everything's been shifted. And then he talks about, in contrast, the other that occurs with a high division of labor is egoistic suicide. This is the type of suicide that occurs when the degree of both social integration and regulation are both low. This is a person who doesn't feel well supported or connected to a social group. They feel like they're an outsider. They feel like they're a loner. They feel like the only people they have in the world is themselves. That's that sense of being isolated and helpless. And that can be either in times of stress, or even in times of success. I mean, one of the things that he found is that single men were much more likely to commit suicide than those with better social connections, whether it was about customs and tradition, jobs, family, marriage, right? This is more true of single men. Men are more likely to seek out an individual life away from community, which can lead to depression and consequently killing oneself. And this is also the one that's classically associated with like the intellectual or the artist, and even sometimes romanticized, right? If we hear stories about like Kurt Cobain or someone like that, right? This would all fall under egoistic suicide. So this is the chart that he lays out. I think it helps you understand how he's trying to figure out mechanisms. He's also trying to understand the shifts that are taking place in society. And it's also pointing to his central concern about what holds us together and provides stability. And that isn't necessarily about what is right or what is wrong, but rather he just simply wants to understand the patterns and help us understand what's going to happen, right? He sees this massive change taking place. He sees the rise of this type of suffering. He sees it connected to the increased division of labor, which he doesn't necessarily think is bad. But he's saying, well, when is it bad and when is it not? So hopefully that makes sense. I will see you all on Monday. Have questions, have parts that you're confused about. Go back through all your notes and readings, and we will work through and prepare you for the test on Wednesday.